"You're obsolete now, Mark. We've got it covered." The words hit me like a slap, delivered with the casual indifference of someone dismissing a waiter after ordering dessert. My name is Mark Winslow. I'm 53 years old, and until yesterday, I was the Senior Systems Integration Architect at Logiflow Solutions in Indianapolis, Indiana. I just spent 13 months architecting and executing the most complex legacy-to-cloud migration in the company's 22-year history. The dashboard showed 100% success at 3:13 a.m. the night before Blake Carmichael called me into his glass office to tell me I was no longer needed. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, extending my hand across his pristine desk. Blake looked genuinely surprised by my response, like he'd expected me to argue or plead. The junior engineers clustered outside the conference room windows looked stunned. I could see their faces through the glass, expressions ranging from confusion to outright shock. Sophia Chen, one of the database administrators I'd mentored for 3 years, actually pressed her palm against the window, like she was watching a car accident. I walked out of that office with the same measured pace I'd maintained for the past 28 years in enterprise IT. 14 of those years had been spent at Logiflow, watching the company grow from a scrappy regional player to a mid-tier logistics software firm, serving Fortune 500 clients across the Midwest. I'd been there when we had 12 employees working out of a converted warehouse. I'd built our first real server room with my own hands, running cable through ceiling tiles and configuring switches until 2 in the morning because we couldn't afford professional installation. Blake Carmichael knew none of this history. He'd been brought in 6 months earlier by the board of directors, a Silicon Valley product guy with zero operations background and a LinkedIn profile full of buzzwords like disruptive innovation and agile transformation. He was 42 years old, 11 years younger than me, with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than most of our employees made in a month. We'd had exactly 2 brief meetings before the migration wrapped up. In the first, he'd nodded along while I explained the complexity of integrating our legacy ERP system with a new cloud infrastructure. In the second, he'd interrupted me halfway through a status update to take a phone call about his Tesla delivery. The migration project had consumed my life for over a year. When we started planning in January of last year, I knew it would be the most challenging technical undertaking of my career. We weren't just moving data from one system to another. We were untangling 15 years of accumulated integrations, custom scripts, and workaround solutions that had been built by different teams using different methodologies across different technological eras. It was like performing surgery on a patient who'd been receiving medical care from a dozen different doctors who'd never spoken to each other. I delayed my knee replacement surgery to see this project through. The orthopedic surgeon had been blunt about the risks of postponing the procedure, but I couldn't leave the migration half-finished. I'd missed my daughter Emma's graduation from Purdue in May because we were troubleshooting a critical data sync issue that weekend. I'd skipped my son David's graduation from IU in December because the final testing phase coincided with his ceremony. My ex-wife Jennifer had stopped speaking to me entirely after I canceled 3 consecutive weekend visits with my aging mother to handle migration emergencies. Outside job offers had come regularly throughout the project. My reputation in the Indianapolis tech community was solid, built on nearly 3 decades of solving problems other people couldn't solve. TechFlow Solutions had offered me a 40% salary increase to lead their cloud infrastructure team. Digital Logistics had dangled a senior architect position with full equity participation. I'd turned them all down because I believed in finishing what I started. Logiflow had invested in this migration, and I wasn't going to abandon ship halfway through the most critical technical transition in the company's history. The complexity of what we'd accomplished was something Blake would never understand. Our legacy system wasn't just old, it was a Frankenstein's monster of interconnected dependencies that had evolved organically over 15 years. The original ERP system had been heavily customized with proprietary modules written in languages that were already obsolete. We had middleware scripts running on 3 different platforms, each one handling critical business logic that couldn't be replicated without intimate knowledge of the original requirements. I'd spent months mapping these dependencies, documenting the data flows, and designing custom integration points that would allow the new cloud system to communicate seamlessly with legacy processes that couldn't be immediately replaced. The architecture I created included trigger chains and fallback relays that operated behind the scenes, invisible to end users but absolutely essential for system stability. These weren't documented in the standard technical specifications because they were implementation details that only I fully understood. The final rollout had been scheduled for a Tuesday night in early March. I'd stayed in the office for 72 straight hours, monitoring every aspect of the migration as we moved terabytes of critical business data to the new cloud infrastructure. The junior developers had taken shifts, but I couldn't sleep knowing that a single misconfiguration could corrupt years of financial records or customer data. At 3:13 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the final verification scripts completed successfully. Every system was green. Every integration point was functioning. The migration was complete, and it was flawless. That morning, Blake had sent out a company-wide email taking credit for the successful migration. The subject line read, "Visionary leadership delivers next-generation infrastructure." The email praised the forward-thinking executive team for driving innovation through strategic technical initiatives. My name wasn't mentioned once, despite the fact that I'd designed every aspect of the architecture and personally overseen every phase of implementation. 24 hours later, I was sitting across from Blake in his glass office, listening to him explain why my services were no longer required. "The migration is complete," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair with the confidence of someone who'd never debugged a critical system failure at 3 in the morning. "We've modernized our infrastructure, and frankly, we don't need old-school approaches anymore. The new system is cloud-native and largely self-managing. You're obsolete now, Mark. We've got it covered." I could have explained that the self-managing cloud system relied on dozens of custom integration scripts that I'd written specifically for Logiflow's unique business requirements. I could have mentioned that the legacy ERP system was still handling 40% of our core business processes and would continue to do so for at least another 2 years. I could have pointed out that the seemingly simple data synchronization between old and new systems required constant monitoring and occasional manual intervention. Instead, I thanked him for the opportunity and walked out of the building I'd called home for 14 years. The security guard at the front desk, an older gentleman named Frank, who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, looked genuinely sad as I handed over my badge and parking pass. "Take care of yourself, Mark," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. "The place won't be the same without you." I appreciated the sentiment, even if I suspected it would prove more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. I drove home to my apartment in Broad Ripple, a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Indianapolis where I'd been living since my divorce 3 years earlier. The apartment was sparse but comfortable, decorated with pictures of my kids and a few pieces of furniture that Jennifer had let me take from the house. I poured myself a bourbon and sat on my couch, staring at my laptop and wondering what came next. At 53, I wasn't ready to retire, but I also wasn't sure I had the energy to start over somewhere new. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week later. I was having coffee with Tom Harrison, a former colleague who'd left Logiflow 2 years earlier to start his own consulting firm. We met monthly to catch up on industry gossip and complain about the state of enterprise IT. Tom's phone buzzed during our conversation, and his expression changed as he read the message. "Holy shit, Mark," he said, looking up from his screen. "Logiflow systems are completely fucked. My contact there says they're hemorrhaging money because of billing errors." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same sensation I'd experienced countless times over the years when a critical system started showing signs of stress. "What kind of errors?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Tom scrolled through additional messages from his contact. Something about client accounts getting misaligned during the billing cycle, refunds being processed incorrectly, customer service is getting hammered with complaints. Their CFO is apparently having a meltdown. The billing cycle, of course. The integration between the legacy ERP system and the new cloud infrastructure relied on a series of scheduled processes that ran during the first week of each month. These processes synchronized customer data, updated account balances, and generated invoices based on usage patterns tracked by multiple systems. The synchronization was handled by a collection of custom scripts that I'd written specifically to manage the complex data relationships between old and new systems. What Blake and his team didn't understand was that these weren't simple data transfer scripts. They were sophisticated integration engines that handled real-time conflict resolution, maintained referential integrity across different database schemas, and included rollback mechanisms that could prevent data corruption during high-volume processing periods. The main orchestration script alone was over 3,000 lines of Python code with embedded SQL procedures that I'd optimized for Logiflow's specific customer workflow patterns. More importantly, the billing process depended on what I privately called the invisible infrastructure, background processes that ran constantly to maintain data integrity between systems that weren't designed to work together. The centerpiece was a daemon I'd written called SyncWatch, running continuously on our primary applications server. Every 30 seconds, SyncWatch would query both the legacy ERP database and the new cloud API endpoints, comparing transaction timestamps and data checksums to identify potential conflicts before they could propagate. When it detected inconsistencies, it would automatically flag the records and trigger corrective scripts that I designed to handle the most common data synchronization scenarios. The daemon also maintained detailed logs of every transaction, creating an audit trail that could be used to reconstruct the exact sequence of events if manual intervention became necessary. None of this infrastructure was documented in the standard technical specifications because it operated below the level of normal system administration. The junior developers knew these processes existed, but they didn't understand how they worked or why they were necessary. To them, billing just happened automatically every month, like magic. They had no idea that behind the scenes, dozens of custom scripts were constantly working to maintain the illusion of seamless integration. My phone started ringing 2 days later. The first call came from Sophia Chen, the database administrator I'd mentored. "Mark," she said, her voice tight with stress, "we're having some issues with the billing system. The junior team is trying to figure out what's wrong, but they're having trouble understanding some of your code architecture. Blake won't let us call you officially, but I was hoping you might be willing to give us some informal guidance. Just between colleagues." I let the call go to voicemail. Sophia was a good kid, and I genuinely liked her, but I wasn't going to clean up Blake's mess for free. The second call came from Mike Torres, the DevOps engineer who'd worked closely with me during the migration. "Mark, we really need your help," he said. "The backend is falling apart, and nobody understands how to fix it. The billing errors are costing us thousands of dollars a day, and Blake is starting to panic. He's too proud to call you directly, but he's authorized me to offer you a consulting contract to help us get things back on track." I deleted that message too. The third call came from Blake himself, though he tried to make it sound casual. "Hey Mark, Blake here. Hope you're doing well. Listen, we're having some minor technical issues related to the billing system. Nothing major, but the team could use some guidance on a few implementation details. Would you be available for a quick consultation? We'd pay your standard consulting rate, of course." By this point, I knew exactly what was happening. The billing cycle ran during the first week of every month, and we were now in the second week of April. The initial data synchronization between systems had completed successfully, but the ongoing maintenance processes were failing. Without constant monitoring and occasional manual intervention, the integration points I'd designed were beginning to break down. Data was becoming inconsistent between systems, leading to billing errors, account discrepancies, and increasingly frustrated customers. The fourth call came from Janet Morrison, the CFO who'd been with Logiflow since the early days. "Mark," she said, dispensing with pleasantries, "we need you back. The billing system is completely fucked, and we're hemorrhaging money. Blake hired some hotshot consultant from Chicago to fix the problems, but the guy took one look at your code and said he'd need 6 months just to understand the architecture. We don't have 6 months. Can you come in tomorrow?" I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The migration I designed was elegant in its complexity, but it required someone who understood the underlying business logic to maintain it properly. The new cloud system was indeed largely self-managing, but only for the processes that had been fully migrated to the new infrastructure. The critical integration points between old and new systems needed constant attention, like a bridge that required regular maintenance to keep traffic flowing safely between two different sides of a river. The problems they were experiencing weren't the result of bad code or poor design. They were the natural consequence of trying to operate a complex system without understanding how it worked. It was like trying to perform surgery after firing the only doctor who knew the patient's medical history. The migration had been successful, but the ongoing integration required institutional knowledge that couldn't be easily transferred or replicated. I finally answered my phone when Janet called for the third time. "Janet," I said, keeping my tone professional, "I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not interested in a temporary consulting arrangement. If Logiflow wants my help, we need to discuss a permanent solution. I'm not going to fix this problem just to have Blake fire me again when he decides I'm obsolete." "What do you want?" she asked, and I could hear the desperation in her voice. "What would it take to get you back?" "I want Blake to publicly acknowledge that the migration required specialized expertise that can't be easily replaced," I said. "I want a written apology for the unprofessional manner of my termination, and I want to be rehired as Chief Systems Architect with a 30% salary increase and guaranteed job security for at least 2 years." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I can make that happen," Janet said finally. "But I need you to start immediately. We're losing clients, and the board is asking questions about Blake's decision-making. Can you be here Monday morning?" "I'll be there," I said. "But first I want to see Blake's written apology and a signed employment contract with the terms we discussed." "And Janet?" "I want the apology delivered personally, in front of the entire development team." Monday morning, I walked into the Logiflow office for the first time in 3 weeks. The atmosphere was tense, with junior developers huddled around monitors displaying error logs and system alerts. Blake was waiting for me in the main conference room, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. The entire development team was assembled, along with Janet and several other members of senior management. "Mark," Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. I made a serious error in judgment when I terminated your employment. Your expertise and institutional knowledge are clearly essential to our operations, and I should have recognized that before making such a hasty decision. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." He handed me a signed employment contract and a written letter of apology. I nodded once and took my seat at the conference table. "Let's start with the billing system," I said, opening my laptop. "The first thing we need to understand is that the cloud migration was successful, but it created new dependencies that require ongoing maintenance. The integration points between old and new systems aren't self-managing. They're carefully orchestrated processes that need constant monitoring." Over the next 4 hours, I walked the team through the architecture I'd designed, explaining the purpose and function of every major integration point. I showed them the daemon processes running in the background, the middleware scripts that translated data between systems, and the fail-safe mechanisms that prevented data corruption. Most importantly, I explained the business logic behind each component, helping them understand not just how the system worked, but why it had been designed that way. The billing errors were caused by a cascade of small failures in the synchronization process. Without proper monitoring, data inconsistencies had accumulated over several weeks until the monthly billing cycle triggered a massive reconciliation process that couldn't handle the volume of conflicts. The solution required manually correcting thousands of account records and implementing better monitoring tools to prevent similar problems in the future. It took 2 weeks to fully restore system stability, during which time I worked closely with the junior developers to transfer knowledge and establish proper maintenance procedures. Sophia Chen proved to be particularly adept at understanding the complex data flows, and I made sure she was thoroughly trained on all critical processes. Mike Torres became our point person for monitoring system health and identifying potential issues before they could escalate. Blake avoided me for most of those 2 weeks, which was fine by me. When we finally had our first real conversation since my return, he seemed genuinely humbled by the experience. "I learned something important," he said during a brief meeting in his office. "I thought that completing the migration meant we'd solved all our technical challenges. I didn't realize that the real work was just beginning. I appreciate you coming back to help us get things right." 6 months later, Logiflow was more stable than it had ever been. The integration between legacy and cloud systems was running smoothly, with comprehensive monitoring and automated alerts that caught potential problems before they could impact customers. The junior developers had grown into their roles, and several of them were already working on plans for the next phase of system modernization. Blake had learned to trust technical expertise over management intuition, and he'd become much more collaborative in his decision-making. He still didn't understand the technical details of what we'd built, but he understood its value and complexity. More importantly, he'd learned that dismissing experienced professionals, based on assumptions about obsolescence, was a costly mistake that could have destroyed the company. The parent company that owned Logiflow took notice of our successful recovery from the billing crisis. They offered me a position as senior technical consultant, working with their portfolio companies to guide complex system migrations and infrastructure projects. The role came with a significant salary increase and the flexibility to work remotely on projects that interested me. I accepted the position and began developing a methodology for managing technical transitions that preserved institutional knowledge while embracing necessary modernization. My relationship with my family improved dramatically once I was no longer working 80-hour weeks on critical projects. I finally had my knee replacement surgery, and I was able to attend my mother's 75th birthday party without worrying about system alerts. Emma and David started calling more frequently, and Jennifer and I even managed to have civil conversations about co-parenting and family logistics. Looking back on the experience, I realized that Blake's dismissal had actually done me a favor. It forced me to recognize my own value and to demand the respect and compensation I deserved. The crisis that followed demonstrated to everyone, including myself, that experience and institutional knowledge couldn't be easily replaced by enthusiasm and modern tools. Sometimes you have to let people fail before they understand what they've lost. I published a white paper 6 months later titled Invisible Infrastructure Risks in Technical Transitions. It became required reading for several technology consulting firms and was cited in multiple industry publications. The paper argued that successful system migrations required not just technical competence, but also deep understanding of business processes and institutional knowledge that took years to develop. It warned against the dangerous assumption that newer technology was inherently self-managing, or that experienced professionals could be easily replaced by younger, less expensive alternatives. The best systems are the ones you never notice until they're gone, I wrote in the conclusion. The most dangerous moment in any technical transition is not during the migration itself, but in the months that follow, when new systems must integrate seamlessly with existing processes while maintaining business continuity. Organizations that dismiss institutional knowledge in favor of cost savings or trendy management philosophies do so at their own peril. Today, I'm working on my third major consulting project, helping a manufacturing company in Detroit navigate a complex ERP replacement. The CEO called me personally after reading my white paper, and our first conversation lasted 2 hours as he described the technical challenges they were facing. We've structured the project to preserve institutional knowledge while embracing necessary modernization, and the results so far have exceeded everyone's expectations. I still keep in touch with several people from Logiflow, including Sophia Chen, who was promoted to Senior Database Administrator, and Mike Torres, who became the company's first DevOps manager. Blake left the company 8 months after my return, officially to pursue new opportunities. Though everyone understood that the board had lost confidence in his leadership, Janet Morrison was promoted to CEO, and under her guidance, Logiflow has become one of the most technically sophisticated companies in their industry. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Blake had handled my dismissal differently. If he'd offered me a generous severance package and acknowledged my contributions to the company's success, I might have walked away quietly and started my consulting career without the dramatic crisis that followed. But then again, the crisis taught everyone involved important lessons about the value of experience, the complexity of technical systems, and the dangers of assuming that progress means abandoning everything that came before. The whole experience reminded me that competence and institutional knowledge have value that can't be easily quantified or replaced. In a world obsessed with disruption and innovation, There's still tremendous worth in understanding how things actually work, why they were built that way, and what invisible processes keep everything running smoothly. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued is simply to prove your worth elsewhere and let the results speak for themselves. I hadn't sought revenge against Blake or Logiflow. I hadn't needed to. I'd simply moved forward, building something better, something that would outlast any individual decision or short-term thinking. The market had validated my expertise, my family relationships had improved, and I'd found work that challenged me intellectually while respecting my experience and knowledge. In the end, being called obsolete had led me to the most fulfilling period of my professional career.